Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce you today to maybe our last session for the California Phenomenology Circle. Today, we have the pleasure to present Mark Ettinger. Mark has a PhD in mathematics from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he studied mathematical logic under the supervision of Jerry Heisler. And he has primarily worked on problems in applied mathematics, focusing on algorithms for data analysis in a variety of environments, including Los Alamos National Laboratory and several companies. He's currently pseudo-retired, but works part-time as adjunct faculty at the University of Florida in the Department of Neurology, analyzing EEG data. He began his study of phenomenology under Giancarlo Rota as an undergraduate at MIT. His two primary philosophical interests are using mathematics to formalize aspects of Husserlian phenomenology and the relationship between phenomenology and contemplative practices. He lives in Joshua Tree, California, with his wife, Katie, and Harper, the best dog in the world. So it's my great pleasure to give you the floor today, Mark.
Thank you very much. Let me share here. Okay, let me just make sure. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Okay, well, thank you for having me. And today I'll be talking about what mathematizing phenomenology is and it isn't. And as Susie mentioned, I'm a mathematician by training, not a phenomenology scholar. So if I make any mistakes or have any misunderstandings, feedback is more than welcome. So this is an outline of what I'll be speaking about today. I'm going to give a brief mathematical overview of a field called active inference, a framework for neuroscience and artificial intelligence, shaped by people who are pretty sympathetic with phenomenology. Then I'm going to talk about a term that this community has introduced called computational phenomenology and why I have some reservations about this terminology. Then I'm going to talk about mathematical phenomenology, which is different than the active inference community's notion of computational phenomenology. And finally, I'll conclude by giving some examples of mathematical phenomenology in the literature. So here's my talking points, my too long didn't listen talking points. Oh, by the way, before we go, would you mind showing how many people here have heard of active inference? Have you heard of this field? No. Okay. Very good. Then these introductories, my slides on active inference will not be a waste of time. Okay. So active inference is a framework which treats perception and action as inference in Bayesian graphical models. Agents encountering and acting in the world desire to minimize something called surprisal, which is a formalization of surprise, the informal notion of surprise, but this is computationally intractable. So free energy is minimized instead. Active inference models are often described as phenomenological due to targeting subjective experience, but active inference is a scientific theory utilizing non-pre-theoretical constructs. And don't worry, I'm not going to go too deep into the math, just enough so the phenomenological issues can come to light. My second talking point is that this term computational phenomenology is misleading, and a better term would be phenomenologically inspired computation. Third talking point is that a purely descriptive, non-predictive mathematical phenomenology is possible and should be sharply distinguished from scientific theories of phenomenological experiences. And finally, I'm going to hold up Jeff's type signature for the horizon as a simple paradigmatic example of mathematical phenomenology. This is the example that I show off to my friends who are interested in discussing this. because it's accessible both mathematically and phenomenologically. Okay, so what is active inference? Well, active inference, by the way, was initiated by a very famous neuroscientist, Carl Friston, in the UK. And it's sort of a follow-on to something called predictive processing. And there are two fundamental principles of active inference. The first one is that agents acting in the world want to minimize their surprise. And they can do this by either updating their model of the world or acting on the world to change it, or both. The second fundamental principle is that agents want to infer the hidden causes of their sensory experiences. These hidden causes are objects in the world. Thus, perception is conceptualized as unconscious inference. So this diagram indicates you have the world producing observations and the agent, whether human or AI, producing predictions. And whenever there's a discrepancy, two things can happen. Either the agent can change their beliefs, their model, or they can act in the world to change the world, to eliminate surprise as best as they can. Okay, so let's talk about the basic mathematical tools for formalizing these ideas. The basic tool is something called a graphical model. And graphical models consist of nodes and directed edges. And associated to each of these nodes is a random variable. If you don't know what a random variable is, think of it as flipping a coin or throwing a die, where you have possible outcomes, and for each possible outcome, there's a probability. So a graphical model is a very concise way of expressing joint probability distributions, where arrows represent dependencies. Now, it's very important to realize that in these graphical models, there are two types of random variables, or two types of nodes. Observed and latent, also called hidden nodes. Hidden nodes are not directly observed and have to be observed from observations. The primary goal in a graphical model is to infer the values of latent variables from data using Bayes' theorem. Okay, has anyone ever seen Bayes' theorem before? Okay, it's a way of updating hypotheses based on observations. On the left side of the equation, that's called the posterior distribution, because it's the probability of a random variable obtaining a certain value after you've taken an observation. In the numerator, on the right-hand side, P of H is called the prior. None of this is that important. You may have heard this terminology before. P of H is the prior. The probability of an observation given hypothesis is called a likelihood, and that if you've ever taken a statistics course, you might be familiar with that. And the denominator is called the model evidence, the probability of the observation. That's going to play a very important role in active inference. Okay, so recall that the first fundamental task of active inference is to minimize surprise, which in mathematics is formalized as surprisal. And it's equal to the minus log of the probability of the observation, where, like I said, the probability, the P of O is called the model evidence. And the second fundamental task is to compute the posterior. Remember, in active inference, we want to infer objects in the world which are producing these observations. And this also requires computing the model evidence because it's the denominator in Bayes' theorem. So for both of our goals, we have to calculate the model evidence, but unfortunately, this is computationally intractable. I'm not going to go into this mathematically, but the reason for it is fairly straightforward. To compute it, you have to take this sum And this sum can be exponentially large. So this is a problem both for a computer doing the modeling and even the brain. So how do we get around this? Well, it turns out, fortunately, that we can approximately accomplish both goals by finding a variational distribution, Q of H, which approximates the posterior by minimizing something called free energy, which approximates surprisal. Okay, so free energy is an upper bound on surprisal, which is what you really want to minimize. By pushing down, by minimizing free energy, you push down on surprisal. And by doing this, we do this by minimizing, by finding a distribution Q, which minimizes this free energy. And I'm not going to go into the details of this formulation, but it's expressed here in this formula. So in a nutshell, this is active inference. It's sort of, at the moment, the only competing paradigm for AI, for deep learning. And the reason we're talking about it is because, interestingly, this community is filled with either phenomenologists or phenomenology adjacent sympathizers. So the next section I'm going to go on to is to talk about some reservations I have. Does anyone have any questions about active inference before I go on? I know this is a very high level. Hopefully it's enough to cover the philosophically interesting components. No? Okay, onward. Okay, so some people in this community have introduced this phrase, computational phenomenology. What is this? I think this quote summarizes it well. Our approach can be described as computational phenomenology because it applies methods originally developed in computational modeling to provide a formal model of the descriptions of lived experience in the phenomenological tradition of philosophy. So that's what these folks are calling computational phenomenology. Basically, mathematical modeling, computational modeling of lived experience. So here's an example. This is an example of a graphical model, which we discussed just before. And this graphical model is intended to describe meta-awareness. In other words, controlling your attention, where attention itself is directed at objects in the world. Now, the details of this model are not important. I'm just going to draw your attention to a few things. The squares in this model are built into the model. They're specified. They're not learned. They're specified by the modeler. And the unshaded circles are observed random variables. They represent observed data. And the shaded circles represent hidden random variables, which we want to infer from the data. And this is a good example of what these folks are calling computational phenomenology, because meta-awareness is, in fact, a lived experience. So this is a good paradigm. And other things that these folks model are things like emotion and meditative states and psychedelic experiences and the whole range of lived experience. Okay? So here are my objections to this terminology. So models in computational phenomenology contain latent variables, unobservables, and therefore these models are not phenomenological, but they're scientific, almost by definition of phenomenology. Now let's consider something like computational biology. In computational biology, we use computation to learn new biology. However, we do not currently learn new phenomenology from these active inference models. But conversely, these computational models are motivated by experiential insight. Thus, the flow of information in computational phenomenology goes from phenomenology to the modeling and not from the model to phenomenology. So what I'm getting at here is that the use of computational phenomenology is really quite different than any other use of the word computational X, like computational biology. So I would suggest alternative terminology, phenomenologically inspired computation. Now, I want to be clear that this is not a criticism of these models or of the science, but rather the terminology, which is likely to be confusing to a pure phenomenologist. This could be considered nitpicking, though I want to convince you it's not when I compare it to what I'm going to call mathematical phenomenology, or what I should say, what I understand mathematical phenomenology is from the literature. It's also interesting to consider the likelihood that a computational model will ever point us to new genuine phenomenological insights. In other words, will we ever have information flowing from a computational model to phenomenology? I think that would be wonderful if it happened. I have to admit, I'm a bit skeptical. I don't really know why I am, but I am. So in summary, here's what I'm trying to draw as pro and con. Active inference is a mathematically fascinating framework for intelligence and agency populated by scientists sympathetic to phenomenology. As far as I know, it's the high watermark in terms of the influence on phenomenology on a scientific domain. But here are my concerns summarized. Perception as unconscious inference sounds uncomfortably familiar because inference is simply a form of computation. And we've all been exposed to the idea of intelligence as computation before and its limitations. Active inference models are often labeled phenomenological models because they are applied to conscious experience. That makes sense, but they make essential use of unobservable variables. And then finally, computational phenomenology is a misnomer for the reasons I mentioned before. Now, in contrast, let's turn our attention to mathematical phenomenology. And I'm not sure this has ever been formally defined, but I think it has a natural definition. So let's define mathematical phenomenology as a use of mathematics to illuminate experiential structures without straying from experience, for example, using latent variables. Now, what's the advantage of this? Well, precision, clarity, and communicability. As a very basic example, consider symmetry. We all learn about symmetry as children at a very young age, probably as soon as we start drawing human bodies with bilateral symmetry. And most everyone understands informally what symmetry means. But the mystery, beauty, and profundity of symmetry really requires understanding the mathematical discipline of group theory. Now, there are many examples of mathematics formalizing experience. For example, topology formalizes nearness, a metric formalizes distance, a bijection formalizes the same sizeness. So we're not interested in that level of generality. We're specifically interested in formalizing uniquely Husserlian structures, especially constitutional structures. For example, the horizon. Here are some examples of mathematical phenomenology that I'm aware of in the literature. I'm very grateful if I've missed anything and people want to drop me a line. I'd love to learn about anything I've missed. Now, all of these, or I should say all of them, but Jeff Yoshimi's, the last one, involve either fairly sophisticated math, fairly sophisticated phenomenology, or both. So that's why I'm going to just point out that I think Jeff's type signature in his book it's my go-to example when I discuss this issue with colleagues and friends. And perhaps you've all seen it already, I don't know, but let me just briefly show you what Jeff's formalization of the horizon is. I'm pretty sure we all know what Husserl meant by the horizon. The horizon consists of anticipated potential future experiences of an object. This is Jeff's formalization. He formalizes it as a function H with a particular type signatures. A type signature is familiar to most mathematicians and computer scientists, or really anyone who's ever done any computer programming in a language like C or Java. It just tells you what the inputs are and what the outputs are. That's what a type signature is. And in this case, Jeff claims that the signature of the horizon is you need a background, you need background knowledge, you need some present visual experience, and you need a hypothetical movement. And if you have these three input ingredients, you get a probability distribution over the future visual experience. Now, this is fairly straightforward, but I want to point out that formalization facilitates the assessment of benefits and drawbacks of alternatives. For example, here's an alternatives to Jeff's original signature. And rather than incorporating a so-called background knowledge set, I'm going to take this background knowledge and remove it from the subjective side and put it into the object. Okay, so I'm going to propose this signature. I should have called it H prime, I guess, where you have an object, a visual experience of that object, and a movement. And then you get a probability distribution over pairs of objects and future visual experiences. So, for example, if you're looking at what you perceive as a house from the front, and the front is painted blue, and you're considering moving around the back, you have a certain probability that you'll see a house with the backside painted red, or you might encounter a movie set. It's not a house at all. It's a different type of object entirely. It's a facade. So my point here is not in any way to argue which of these is right. My point here is to argue that without formalizing this type signature, it's very hard to communicate this sort of distinction. And I just want to conclude by mentioning that last year, Thomas Metzinger called for formalizations of pure awareness. And so I wrote a brief essay which tried to make a contribution to mathematical phenomenology. And this is the link if anyone's interested, and feedback is very welcome. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this great presentation. We know that we have already a question from Stella. Can you please close the PDF, the presentation, so we can see each other? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. So I just had a small clarification question on your distinction between phenomenology and science. So is it just about, well, because I'm sort of coming from Husserl thinking of phenomenology as a kind of science, but is your distinction more about how a model is used for the particular discipline?
Well, I mean, I'm aware that Husserl called phenomenology the first science, something like that. Is it? So you know, it's not a. I don't think of phenomenology as a science in the sense of physics. I consider it rigorous, like Husserl did for sure. but I think it's to be distinguished from the natural sciences.
So
And, you know,
yeah,
and I think Husserl does a great job at indicating why that's the case. And like when you do phenomenology, what you have to, you know, when you do the epoche, what you have to suspend, you know, I'm not allowed to use neuroscientific arguments and so on, right? I'm not allowed to use theoretical constructs. It's all about what is directly evident in some appropriate sense of direct. Um, so that's the distinction I'm making, if that makes
okay.
sense.
So you wouldn't consider mathematics as a science in your characterization.
Oh, I wouldn't consider, I don't think of mathematics per se as a science, right? I mean, it's a rigorous study of a certain domain of objects. I mean, when I think of science, I think of the natural sciences, right?
Okay.
Um, that it's not my intention to sort of get into an argument about the best definition of science, but as long as these distinctions are clear, you know, what you're allowed to use and what you're not allowed to use when you're doing phenomenology, I'm fine with it.
Okay. Thank you.
Jeff.
Yeah, hi. Thanks a lot for that, Mark. It was I really enjoyed it. Oh,
Great,
um,
thanks.
and it was nice to see my work expressed that way, which was really fun. Also, a quick note: I do have to leave at noon, but I'm going to go onto the phone, so I'll be listening in just as a note. So I wanted to ask my question early. Really, I mean, I think I agreed with just about everything you said. I'm writing a paper on this summer, so I'll definitely be in touch and I'll be referring to this. I just think I buy the argument basically. But one question about active inference as being, kind of a high watermark in merging phenomenal or of computational phenomenology. I think I see why you say that. I think active inference people have been much more friendly to actual phenomenology than people in other areas. But of course, integrated information theory is a natural thing to ask about. They explicitly start from phenomenological axioms. They say the whole theory is derived from it. They say that the theory is going to give them both of these directions you talk about, right? They'll be able to compute phi and other quantities for physical systems and infer not just the level, but the contents of consciousness from that. So there's allegedly anyway, there's a deep integration there. I'm curious your thoughts on it.
I have to say, I don't know integrated information theory. I mean, there's been a number of times where I've tried to read some basic introductions. It's not recently, and I wasn't able to get too much out of it. It doesn't mean there's nothing great there. It's just I don't know that at all. And you know, active inference, this community, I don't mean to imply that the entire community is phenomenologists, but there's a very active vocal segment of the community that's very interested in Husserlian phenomenology, and they publish and they make their work known. You know, I've never encountered such a thing with integrated information theory. So if it's out there and I'm missing it, Jeff, if you could drop me a reference, I would love to dig into it. Like I said, it's, you know, in that slide, I said, as far as I know, right? So if it turns out that IIT is another high watermark or higher, then I'm excited.
Okay, yeah, I'll follow up by email. Thanks.
Mike.
Oh yeah, so I just had this terminological question, because I wanted to better understand what you meant by computational phenomenology and why you object to it terminologically. And so only recently have I learned that the way the phrase computational is used in cognitive science, it doesn't refer to like cognition or any kind of like conceptual exercise on the subject's part, but has to do with something like an algorithmic structure, for example, of your eye lens of your eyes, and this algorithmic structure which you define the functional, nature of your eyes or whatever, retina, what have you. that this is what they mean by computation. So computation, as it's used by some philosophers and cognitive scientists, or maybe this may be the dominant usage, is referring to something subpersonal and consequently subphenomenological. Is that why you are opposed to the idea of computational phenomenology? I mean, is that another way of looking at the opposition to computational phenomenology, that the nature of computation is something subpersonal and therefore there can be nothing phenomenological about computation?
No, that's not quite it. I mean, take phrases like computational biology, computational economics.
All of which makes sense to me.
In all of these fields, people are using computation to learn new biology, new economics, etc. I don't know what computation, I don't know cognitive science, so I'm not exactly sure how they use it, but in the fields I'm familiar with, the computation makes you learn new elements of the original field, like biology. And that is not what's happening in computational phenomenology. There's no pretense in that we learn that new phenomenology is learned from these models. In contrast, the idea is that these models will make predictions like any other scientific field. Now, there's another issue which I should mention, is that so far active inference, these models tend to be toy models, and I don't mean that pejoratively. What I mean is that, you know, they're not at the level where they can actually be used in engineering practice, with some small exceptions, right? They might someday be overthrow something like deep learning for these applications, but right now they lag far behind. So, but the goal is prediction. And, you know, in my view, phenomenology is not about making predictions like you do in physics. It's about making clear, precise descriptions. So, so that was the second of the two objections I had, right? Like the use of the word computational phenomenology is in no way parallel to uses like computational biology, computational chemistry, things like that. There is a lack of a parallel. The second one is...
Could you give us an example of doing computational biology or chemistry? What would that be like?
Yeah, so so in genomics, learning new genetic facts about chromosomes, for example, by using computation to find the areas of DNA which code for proteins and those that do not. Right? That's something that was unknown, you know, before the era, before the genome was sequenced, and people could start to apply algorithms to find coding areas of DNA and non-coding areas and so on, right? That's one example. Gene expression, right? Using algorithms to evaluate what genes are being expressed under different circumstances, like, and so on, right? I'm not an expert in this field, by the way. I used to do this stuff 25 years ago. Everything has changed. But that was my second objection. My first one is that to a philosopher, if they hear computational phenomenology, in my estimate, they're going to be puzzled and confused if they see these latent variables, things which are by definition unobservable. Now, maybe you guys disagree with me. Maybe as professional philosophers, you're like, no, that wouldn't throw me off. Well, then I'd be wrong. And that's fine. But I would expect that terminology to throw you off, right? Because these graphical models it's a fundamental distinction between the things that are observed and the things that are not observed and have to be inferred. And to me, that means that the model is scientific and predictive, not phenomenological and descriptive.
Right. David.
My mic is on again. Thanks a bunch. I'm listening from a long distance from all of this stuff. You were at MIT briefly and met Giancarlo Rota, as I did about 100 years ago, it seems, before Irvine attracted my attention. Anyway, I'll get your email and we'll talk later about that.
Absolutely.
Okay, here's a problem. Well, I take the issue really cool between to what extent are the mathematical forms influencing the phenomenological description and vice versa. And then I can see that the one model goes, maybe you can take direct mathematics into the phenomenology of the computational version, and going the other way. The interesting thing is what goes back and forth. So one of the features, and I should say Stella's been my guide through model theory and how these issues that are always in the background of the original possible worlds modeling that I learned from, from Hintica and so on. So closer to the phenomenology and somewhere in between the choices I've always been influenced or intrigued by indexical reference, not just in language, but primarily in perception. So it's kind of obvious in its own way, right? But the point of the indexicality that I've always felt and continue to feel is that the experience points towards something, and then there's a background to be filled in. And if there's mathematical structure that applies, let me jump to the issue that I want to get on the table. What is pure for, first of all, I've worked a lot recently on what is pure experience all about. And now I think Stella's question was, if mathematics is pure, and if your idea of a kind of natural science as opposed to the phenomenologic direct experience, then the issue of how do people think today about purity, what's pure or not in a mathematically formulated theory. I think that's the big question. And the phenomenon that I have in mind is that it has long struck me that a certain kind of basic idea coming from model theory as an improvement on set theory even, that basic intuition carries over into the phenomenology. Jeff and I have talked about the way Husserl talks about a zigzag methodology, and I've noticed more and more people pick up on it, meaning you're in the experience, then you move out into the world, and then you're back into the experience. And Husserl calls that a zigzag movement. First in the historical science of, trying to understand the meaning that something of geometry in the ancients into very contemporary theory. You move back and forth in history, is the way Husserl put it. That is to say, between the concepts as they were developed then and the concepts as they have evolved and are developing now. So in the basic perceptual experience, then what I like to argue is that the zigzag methodology is already there, but it messes around with the idea of what's pure. That's what I'm going to put on the table. Pure mathematics, pure science, pure phenomenology, pure experience. So I have intuitively thought that certain aspects of a kind of informal understanding of the mathematics can indeed shape the phenomenology. And that's what I think I've tried to do a long time ago and continue. So if there's a question there that's clear, we'll take over, Mark.
Okay, well, I feel as though I know I don't have a problem with pure mathematics, but pure experience, now that is terminology which is not, I mean, people argue about what pure experience is a great deal. That's a whole nother, it's a can of worms, in my opinion. I don't know. I don't have a firm position on that. That touches on my other interest that was Susie had mentioned in my introduction about contemplative practices, right? People who do meditation, and by the way, I don't know if you remember, David, but years ago we corresponded a little bit about meditation, but by email.
I remember your name and forgot where, so thanks very much. I agree with the problem is right up there front for us. Yeah.
Yeah, so people who are very into these contemplative practices, they're very fond, as a caricature only, they're very fond of saying, well, your experience isn't pure, it's not deconceptualized enough, and that sort of thing, right? That's a caricature, of course, of the community. So that is a can of worms, which would be fun to dive into. I'm not sure about the whole, I don't know what the zigzag, I don't know if you mean dipping into and out of the natural attitude versus the phenomenological attitude. I don't know if that's zigzag or if it's something else. I'm not clear.
Well, let me follow up with that. I've been trying to get help from my German-speaking colleague about the term that is translated as attitude. So what's moving the in and out? One version of the pure is between the East Coast and West Coast styles, supposedly not very good terminology anymore, where the East Coast is, you're supposed to take a pure attitudinal shift. But the original German Einstellung is putting in place, and I think Stella picked up on this earlier in the discussions that we've had, that we're not, let me put it this way, we're not so much in the, call it in the wake of skepticism, where we're bracketing what we can't be sure of. I mean, the flow of Descartes' argument in the Meditations goes that way. But if you stop at the first or the second of the Meditations, you haven't gone on to the further ontology. And I think you can still have some ontology in the picture at that point, but it's focused on the experience without these additional environmental conditions that are brought in. So I thought you were actually pointing toward a way of modeling in a mathematical way, the phenomenon of reaching out into the world and getting something that's beyond something called the pure experience. That's kind of the feeling that I had. So, what I really have in mind, and this really goes back to how many decades of the intuition of what's so important about, I see this tree. Well, this takes you, and then the Sellers famously said, you can't get away without putting in the kind, this kind, but we do. And I always used to play with experiments. You're driving along in the fog and you see this approaching, and then you have to get further to get even a type out. So there's an out of the experience. So my take on the zigzag methodology is which is, I think, compatible with a way of understanding epoche in a way that people don't understand it. You are in a situation, that's the Einstellung. Instead of we're not sure about it, the evidence, we're in the situation, we know that's the life world idea that comes later. But I think it's cooking all the way through Husserl to stay with the phenomena. So my intuition is that you're moving back and forth all the time in perception, and that the Bayesian models that you're using seem to be directly applicable to something like that. So I can't see that we get purity. So it kind of worms, well, how about boundary, a blurring of the boundary between what is pure and what is the context, thus the indexicality is important. What is the context of the pure experience of this? And do we use that as fodder for the mathematical modeling? Again, applied as opposed to pure mathematics, but applied mathematics. And then going the other way, can we use a sharpened model to get a better understanding of what it is to go in and out of experience? And then back to epoche, a different understanding of epoche, which I think my colleague implies is better to the German. The word attitude is taken over, and it should have been placement, literally. So we're in this wide world context, and we're trying to figure out within that. And actually, your pictures showed that, because there's the world and there's our experience. When are we moving back and forth? And what is pure here or pure there would be another nice way of looking at the model that we had there. So back to you.
Okay. There's a lot there. I'm not sure. So I guess I guess I don't know if this is directly applicable to what you're getting at. I mean, I'm not clear that computation will ever actually provide new phenomenology. Like I said, I don't really have a dog in this fight, right? If it does, I think that would be wonderful. But for some reason, I'm just very skeptical. Like I said earlier, the flow is in these models, in this community. And I think this was the primary emphasis of Varela all the way back, when they wrote Naturalizing Phenomenology. The flow goes from phenomenological experience, and then that goes into the science, right? It's the other direction that I have to confess I'm skeptical of. I would celebrate as much as anyone if that occurred, but I'm just skeptical.
Follow up. One of the weird terminological points that Husserl used, which Dallas Willard seemed to understand, and I'm not sure that I do. Husserl made a distinction between two kinds of forms, let's say, or essences, Wesen, between the exact and what he called morphological. And I don't quite understand what that means, but this idea of pure and applied would be suggestive of that. So there's something about a kind of exactness, but more on your side. But we have an experience that's more exact here or more shaped over there. And the morphological somehow comes from shapes. I think probably there's real mathematics that can make some distinctions there. But then we're back in the mathematics world and how we're applying it. So I think there's something in the lived experience that is like between the exact, I get this, and the morphological, well, it's a pine tree or it's a palm tree or it's a spruce tree or whatever. So there's something about our experiences that has the difference between what Husserl is aiming for toward exact essence or type and something else that's inexact. So we wouldn't, so again, we're keeping the primary base of the phenomenology in the realm of experience, even if we start to model over here really, or back, I don't know whether it should be out in the world with the mathematics or up above the world in a more Platonic way than we're supposed to go with these days.
I think of mathematical objects is in the world, not the natural world, not the physical world, but
that's nice. I agree.
When it comes to philosophy of mathematics, I'm a Husserlian realist. Not, some people use the word Platonism. I don't, that's metaphysics to me. I think
I agree, and give a nod written recently on Bolzano that way. It's not Plato and it's not Frege, it's Bolzano that Husserl is drawing on. And he's a mathematician of the infinite, so we'll go with that.
Yeah, I think of mathematical objects as
worldly,
just as real as a tree. As my mentor Rhoda used to say, it's something you have to deal with. He used these slightly Heideggerian phrases, right?
Yeah, bring him in.
Rhoda, when I learned phenomenology 40 years ago, in these courses at MIT, he would blur the distinction between Husserl and Heidegger. There was, one content with two course titles. And it was only after I dove into this after college that I realized that Husserl and Heidegger in many ways were significantly different. But, Rhoda often, to hammer home a point, would use Heideggerian terminology like deal with.
Very familiar with several of us here, right? Everybody jump in, Hack and Mike, Susie, Jeff, everybody.
I saw that Jeff made a comment about the concept of purity that might be relevant for what we're saying about this zigzag.
Jump in. I can't read and listen at the same time. I'm a defective.
You know, I was just distinguishing purity in the sense of Metzinger and pure experience, like a meditative state, from a pure discipline, like pure logic or pure logical grammar, where the idea is just that the one discipline isn't influenced by others.
Yeah.
And I think your discussion actually kind of wound through both,
Mhm.
zigzagged through both. So
Right.
I'm satisfied. Yeah.
Oh, by the way, it just occurred to me, David, you're a colleague with Stella, right?
Mhm.
Stella did a dissertation with me. She's a real mathematician.
Yeah. So before she dropped off, as far as I know, she's looking into homotopy type theory. So if you could
Exactly, that's her target.
I think that stuff is great, and I think it has a deep phenomenological relevance. So
It's where my math left off.
Yeah.
Time for topology. Let's go. Right.
So if you speak to her and just drop her a message that if she's interested in discussing homotopy type theory and phenomenology, to drop me a line.
Okay. And send me your email so I have that somewhere correctly. Also update. Where are you living now?
I'm in Joshua Tree, California.
Uh-huh.
Here's my email.
She also wrote a comment before leaving. She wrote, I was thinking that the method of zigzag could be applied to computational phenomenology. If we take phenomenology as a methodological science, then what makes computational phenomenology phenomenology could be the methods we apply to the computational models.
Oh, shoot. I just realized that my email address will appear on YouTube. Is there any way to
No,
blur
it doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't show the comments.
Send it to me, period, and I'll get it that way.
Well, it's here in chat right now, as long as it's not going to appear on YouTube.
No, it doesn't. The chat doesn't show. That's why I read the message of Stella. So if you want to comment, people watching on YouTube can
I see.
have a bit of the discussion. Do you have anything to say to her about this comment, Mark? Did you hear me reading it?
I have to talk more. I have to figure out more about this notion of zigzag. At the moment, I don't have a clear grasp.
Sure. All right. Are there more questions? It seems some of us need to leave noon, and we have still time for questions if any of you have some.
Well, I would just more cheering for realism in its different forms. So I think the zigzag goes through that, and I think it's a nice way to think of the mathematical as part of the world. I mean, I think of the particle ontology is doing a lot more work in an intuitive way than we usually recognize, and that gives you a distinction between the concrete and the shareable, which is the beginning of so-called Platonism. But no, let's just keep realism. Put those in the world over here that we have to go back and forth between. I think that's a very helpful part in itself. And then the other point is whether I'm right or wrong. It depends on how Kantian you are about the application of FOK, which is more Cartesian in Husserl's terms, and he wants some of both. And then Heidegger is in a way trying to get away from the solipsistic sound of Husserl. But if you look at the proper flow, both from the phenomenology as we live it, no, we're not idealists at all. And skepticism is a special problem for somewhere over. And then, of course, my colleagues across the campus are Bayesian, and Brian Skirms and so on. So that's a lot of application that works very nicely, but there are different ways of moving back and forth, which would realize a zigzag model, which I'm just trumpeting a little bit because I think it works. Good.
Have you written anything up on this zigzag notion?
Yeah, I have one article in the last 3 years or something on metaphysics, edited by Frode Kjosevich and others at Oslo. I think it's a Routledge book. about 3 years ago.
I will, it's called Metaphysics.
Metaphysics, and then it's about the historical and the conceptual, and phenomenology is weaving through it. Look for Kjosevic, Kjovic, Kjosevic, the Norwegian name, and 2 others, but that gets it started. So it is a book on metaphysics is a hot thing in metaphysics. How do we do it? And one of my colleagues, well, one time a student, Amy Thomason, is a champion of a neo-Carnapian way. And the zigzag works very nicely in the Carnapian, sort of bringing more of the science in of the empirical science, a very Carnapian way, into the ordinary experience. So sometimes Amy Thomason starts with ordinary language, but she has in mind ordinary experience as well. And that's another way of kind of sharpening the difference between the pure and the more mathematized. How do you get from ordinary language into formalized models, whether it's, think of it as semantics, but even linguistics has to begin with what are the phonemes and so on. And then in non-alphabetic languages, everything is all the more interesting. So pure or applied. Well, you could stay with the forms in the world and the concrete and the particulars that are in the world, and that'll also get you a kind of distinction between what's pure or not. And Husserl, I mean, we know if your distinctions are pretty clear by now. The move from the concrete, the particular to the eidetic or the essences is not the same as the move from the pure experience to the impure realization, and then often running into the neurology. You've done a lot of work on information theory now, so I just listen from afar, and I'm what do I call myself, a pre-digital, not a digital native.
I see.
I listen, but haven't. Well, I did take one course in a language I won't even mention. It's so old, way back at Northwestern when I was still in engineering and hadn't found my way into phenomenology yet. So, but I was wondering how, since you would give us a nice talk also about the generative AI things, and all the philosophers are freaking out about AI because, well, no, it's not. Oh, I saw a terrible article by a wonderful commentator just buying into the idea that generative idea is going to make a species that's new. Oh my God. Okay. I go, bring us on. First will bring us on. Let the experience lead us on. And I share you, Mark, your intuition, as it were, that the types of structure that we live through are their own thing. And the mathematical model is going to be changing that, even if it might help us to see some of that. The phenomena are the phenomena. So that's a very traditional view, but I think that's staying close to what the experience is all about. What was the reference about, you mentioned Metzinger, I don't read, about getting pure awareness involved? I've been thinking about it, precisely that question.
Well, last year he came out with this book about, where he interviewed a couple hundred meditators who, it's on the subject of pure consciousness. I can't remember the name of the book. I can look it up if you're interested. Anyway, if you look up Metzinger Pure Consciousness, you'll find the name of this book.
I will look at that.
And then he offered a monetary prize for a formalization, and it was very wide open. And my essay did not satisfy some of the requirements, but I wanted to get it in front of the eyes of people who knew both mathematics and philosophy and this area of meditative interest. So I didn't expect to win the money, but I used it as an opportunity to write down, in the tradition of what of that list of, like you in your book and Jeff in this Horizon signature, of what I consider to be real mathematical phenomenology. That's why I wrote the essay. Not, it would have been nice to win the money, but I didn't qualify for the prerequisites.
A final parting thought about pure and the zigzag. What I have in mind is I spend a lot of time on unpublished long piece study. I was bouncing off Dave Chalmers' newest book a couple of years ago called Reality Plus. He was hung up on VR instead of AI.
Oh, I read that. Yeah.
Yeah, put them together. But he does a nice job of working his way through appearance reality into really the Cartesian certainty problem. And I wanted to bounce off that to get at the so-called hard problem of consciousnesses. Well, what's left over is always the lived experience. So there's something pure about moving from the experience to the object of experience, basic intentionality. So that's a move. But I wanted to, again, to put that together with a prior point that Husserl can also seems always to come back to say, no, we didn't lose anything with the brackets. And it's hard to say what that means unless you say a lot more than he does, right?
Mm.
But the interesting idea of shifting from the idea of a mere shift in attitude, I mean, that's cool in itself. But the shift is to an attitude where you are taking the surrounding world, the Umwelt, later the life world, the Lebenswelt, taking that seriously as part of the epoche. You're in that, so that gives me a certain kind of zigzag maneuver, which I think a lot of different moves are trying to get at that. But again, if you stay with the with the example of everyday perception, you can't help but go in and out of the experience, certainly in reflection, but also in the experiencing itself. You're in the world with the tree, and then, ooh, comes surprise. Well, it moved in the wrong way. What's happening here? Was it an earthquake, or was it the wind, or was it the crow that I just saw leave the branch that starts to move? A lot of interesting changes just in very, very mundane experiences.
Mm.
So we're always in that, placed in that world, and we move back and forth between what we're talking about in that world, the experience or the object or the surrounding world. And then it gets really interesting when you have collective intentionality, and it's our communal experience that we get in. So, and later Husserl, of course, emphasizes that, well, it's not that late, it's the middle of Husserl already. In fact, with time consciousness and other consciousness, it's always brewing along from the beginning. So with apologies to the people who can work in the archives, I still, whenever I have new results, I see them. Yeah, and I got that already from the earlier works that were through. So pure experience, well, when you can focus on that part, more part whole theory, on that part of the full experience, placement in the world, when you're talking about the things themselves outside or the phenomena themselves as lived, something to work on. Okay. Mike, Hawk, a combination.
I came to this stuff actually before doing philosophy. I did physics. And so my appreciation of mathematics has always been guided by that. So as a physicist, you model nature mathematically, but you're never of the opinion that the math is going to show you new physical phenomena. And the example I'm always thinking of is this. So Einstein at some point modeled gravity on differential geometry. Then it turns out that his equations have a finite set of exact solutions. One of these, found out by Gödel, assumes that all the mass in the universe is in an infinite cylinder, and you're moving around an infinite cylinder, and then strange things happen to your time coordinate. Now, no physicist thinks that if we look out there, we will find an infinite cylinder with all the mass of the universe. it's a possible solution to these equations, right? And a lot of corners of physics have things like that, where the mathematical formalism produces some kind of a solution which we reject because it's just not physical. And I'm wondering if in physics, I don't expect every mathematical solution to correspond to reality, to what extent should I expect a computational model of perception and cognition to show me new experiential content or new phenomenology, right? And isn't that just an intrinsic limit of modeling mathematically, right? That at the end of the day, a mathematical solution does not necessarily correspond to experience, whether it's physical experience or conscious experience, right?
Well, I would say that there's two different issues in operation in your observation. You know, the one observation is that oftentimes mathematical descriptions or equations require something like initial conditions. And so, you know, Einstein's equation for general relativity is very general. It doesn't specify what the actual distribution of matter is. It simply says if the distribution of matter is this, this will be the shape of space-time. But so that's one issue, but the other issue is I think mathematics is so tightly bound with physics that I would definitely, I'd say that mathematics shows us new physics. The reason why this is not clear necessarily is because there's almost no pre-mathematical physics. Like, for example, if I throw a ball in the air, I can describe its trajectory as an arc. But that's really about all I can do until I introduce some degree of math. Once I do that, introducing the math allows me to write down the precise trajectory. So I definitely think in this case, but see, I think in some of these conversations, there has to be a distinction. I'm trying to make the distinction between computational and mathematics. You know, I think Jeff's signature among those other references I listed shows that mathematics can definitely contribute to phenomenological insight. To me, this is a settled issue, right? I think that the notion of the horizon absolutely benefits from a formalization like Jeff wrote down. To me, this is settled. The notion of whether computation can contribute to phenomenological insight, I think is very open. And I'm a bit skeptical. I would be delighted if this skepticism was shown to be wrong. The idea, I will get phenomenological insight wherever I can get it, at whatever price. Like, you know, I'm not trying to say, I just don't think it's likely. Because, and why I don't think it's likely is maybe something I have not yet adequately explored in my own understanding, right? But, you know, I just wanted my main current objective is to point out that these folks are using the word computational phenomenology in a very different way than people usually use the phrase computational X.
Sounds right. Stella will have a lot to say about this. What I'm listening in on from long arm length from the math is that so for earlier generations like me, set theory was supposed to be giving this sort of, with Quine and onward, you know, how to get precise from ordinary language. And the move to different kinds of type theory, the homotopy type theory that were Stella started in Amsterdam, thinking also about the intuitionists who were reading Husserl in that way. So the idea that there are different kinds of mathematics is always constantly changing, and we might get some better understanding. And I hear what you're saying about hidden variables.
Well, specifically with respect to homotopy type theory, the most exciting thing about homotopy type theory in the context of phenomenology is the fact that homotopy type theory is an attempt to formalize, mathematize the notion of identity, which to me is one of, if not the fundamental insights of phenomenology and also of the contemplative practices that I'm interested in. In other words, our actual experience is a flux, and yet somehow out of that flux crystallizes objects.
And
right? Like trees.
The identity is between forms, right?
No, by identity, I simply mean something very simple: objectness, items, right?
Right. But
So
objects that have certain forms, right?
yes, as a tree, when I walk around a tree, my imminent experience is in flux, right? It's never the same twice, but the tree itself is an identity. And
oh, I see.
And
really, it's
a transcendental object, right? It's a transcendental object. It's a unity which arises out of diversity. And homotopy type theory is making this rigorous, mathematical. And now, at least when it applies to mathematical objects, right? The degree to which this will contribute to the phenomenology of identity, or as Rhoda used to say, itemness, which I think is more Heideggerian, has yet to be seen. But I think it's promising. I think it's very exciting. Because homotopy type theory, well, this is going into the weeds of the math a bit, but they've taken something from intuitionistic type theory, which has always remained mysterious and somewhat trivial, these identity types, and they've said this is inherently geometrical. And these identity types are not always trivial. They have structure. And I think this structure can contribute to our understanding of transcendental objects. But that's very vague. And so I'm not really prepared to expound on it much more.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the intuitive notion of structure, and we live with structure in some sense. And the mathematizing of it is back to the original question. Right, got it.
I think homotopy type theory, for me, is the most exciting development in mathematics in the last 20 years. I mean, that's, of course, this is taste, right? I'm only saying something personal, but for me, and I don't work in that. I mean, those fields are not, except for the logical aspect, are not really my own, right? I don't really know the classical homotopy theory from geometry that informs this development. But I just am tremendously excited by this work.
Well, wish Stella were still with us, but maybe she can check in later.
That'd be great. I'd love to have a conversation with her. I've seen her name floating about, and at one of these recent meetings, you mentioned her work in this, David. So I'd love to speak with her.
Looks like Susie left. Is she still in charge?
She's here.
Still here. I'm incredibly hungry. I'm sorry. We're talking about mathematics, but I still have a body and I'm really starving.
Right.
I know. So I was going toward the kitchen to get some food, but I'm still here listening to you.
You know, so
Well,
I just want to say that, you know, I'm not a professional philosopher, so my community of people to discuss these issues is very small to non-existent. So if anyone wants to correspond, by all means, drop me an email. I'd love to hear, even if it's very critical things.
well, one of the interesting things that I'm listening to it from a very long arm's length again is that from our call it our more primordial experience is very geometrical more than logical as object predication essence. And that would be the shift from set theory to homotopotype theory, again, listening from far away on both of those. But I guess that means it's something meaningful in finding something meaningful in the experience. And I buy everything that Harkamish mentioned, because yeah, I started with the math and the physics too, but even the applied version, and was intrigued and somehow got into phenomenology. And that takes us into lived experience of things, which begins perceptually. And yeah, that's much more to do with phenomenology from there. So hooray. Okay. Any comments from people? Susan, in charge.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. This is really food for thoughts. And my way, I always think, who knows if one day we'll be able to mathematize. Well, maybe we're doing it already. Our personal experiences, our psychological experiences, our innermost thoughts, and so on. So thank you. You gave us a great array of thoughts to reflect on. So, and thanks to all
Thank
of
you
you
all.
for these interesting discussions. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Take care.